the Wall Street Consensus is a sort of a play on the Washington Consensus, this paradigm in international development that we had since the 1980s, which argued that for countries to develop, what they needed to do was to unleash market forces. And the Washington Consensus came with a list of prescriptions. There were 10 policy commandments, as we call them, organized around three basic instructions, if you want, which were to liberalize both international trade and domestic markets, to privatize state-owned companies, and to stabilize the macroeconomic environment by putting central banks in charge, independent central banks, putting them in charge of inflation, and sort of downgrading fiscal authorities to a second fiddle in the macroeconomic policy sort of institutional framework. Fiscal authorities being expected to not do very much, and particularly to not engage in sort of populist fiscal expansions that would undermine the task of targeting inflation. Now, this paradigm, the Washington Consensus, became very contested for reasons that were very clear once you looked at the outcomes. Particularly because unleashing market forces didn't generate either the kind of development that it promised and came with very significant social costs and distributional consequences. Now, the Wall Street Consensus comes on the back of this paradigm. It's promoted by the World Bank, by the International Monetary Fund, by the G20, a host of initiatives, particularly since 2015, but you can trace a sort of longer history of it if you want. And it starts by recognizing that the idea of unleashing market forces, and that will deliver on all the sort of development ambitions that we have, this idea doesn't really work in practice to the extent and the scale that is necessary to achieve either the Sustainable Development Goals or to deal with the climate crisis. So what is needed, starting from this market failure, is to crowd in private capital or to mobilize private capital, to both bring in the state as an agent that does the mobilization of private capital, but to also think about how to make development investable. And by this, I mean, if you want to have a new hospital and you don't have as a state fiscal resources, because there are some very clear assumptions about what the state can and cannot do with fiscal resources, then what you need to do is to convince BlackRock or another large asset manager from the global north who is sitting on trillions of US dollars that could invest. You need to convince them to come and invest in your country, to convince them to invest in this hospital. You need to think very carefully about the question, why don't they invest on their own? Why doesn't the market provide this on its own? And the answer is, well, the market doesn't provide this because the risk-return profile of this hospital is not fully aligned with what an investor would expect. In other words, either risks are too high or returns are too low. So the Wall Street Consensus is a very kind of comprehensive way of thinking how to adjust risk returns, how to move some risks from the balance sheet of private finance or private capital onto the balance sheet of the state to make development projects investable. And it's not just hospitals, it's schools, it's other social infrastructure, it's water, it's climate, it's nature, forests, everything can become an asset class. And I think this vocabulary is very important because it is the vocabulary of private finance brought into the debates around international development. Important question, I think, why does de-risking have such political appeal? And let me just first take a step back and notice that one of the many initiatives that have propelled de-risking and kind of energized de-risking as a development paradigm under this Wall Street Consensus umbrella is the United Nations Financing for Development Conference in Addis Ababa in 2015. That was entitled From Billions to Trillions, the idea that we have to mobilize trillions in private capital and to kind of channel it to flow from the global north into the global south in development projects. And for governments in the global south, this is an attractive proposition. De-risking is an attractive proposition because what it says to politicians is you don't need to engage in radical transformations of your macroeconomic policy institutions. You don't need to realign or to get rid of this monetary dominance framework where the central bank targets price stability and the fiscal authority does what it can without obstructing this. You don't need to change radically anything. What you need to do is basically tinker or play with price signals in this project, make it a bit more attractive for private capital to crowd it in. So to me, there is a kind of both political appeal in the sense that it tells politicians in countries in the global south, you can do large infrastructure projects, even if you don't have public finance, the public money for it. You just have to redirect some of your fiscal resources into making or into mobilizing, enabling private investment. But it also has a kind of institutional appeal because it says you don't need to change massively anything, right? So you think about the climate crisis. When we talk about the climate crisis, we think and we accept from, I guess, across the political spectrum, we accept that it requires a radical transformation of domestic, both infrastructure and productive structures, right? You have to change everything in order to shrink the carbon footprint of your economic activity, of your infrastructure. And the Wall Street consensus says, well, great, I have a solution for you that doesn't require massive institutional change. I have a solution for you that doesn't require you to build up state capacity to a great extent. And we know state capacity has been very severely eroded by the Washington consensus. What you need to do is you need to sit down with BlackRock or with institutional investors, with Aberdeen Asset Management. You need to sit down with philanthropies like the Tony Blair Institute, who's, for example, been very instrumental in designing this de-risking-based approach to Indonesia's decarbonization of the energy sector. So you need to sit down with them, think about partnerships, frame your development projects through the logic of partnerships with private capital, and that's it, you're done. So it's politically, it's very appealing. And I can see why, because, if you live with 4-year electoral cycles, you think, in 4 years, maybe I can get BlackRock to build me 2 wind farms and 1 green hydrogen plant. In terms of distributional consequences, or even in terms of the way in which it reimagines the state, the Wall Street consensus is not that different from the Washington consensus. It, as you rightly pointed out, it still pushes for the privatization of public goods, for the privatization of social goods, for the privatization of the social contract between the state and its citizens. But it has an added layer, which to me is fascinating. It doesn't say the market will do, if we privatize, the market will deliver. It says we have to bribe these private actors into doing the things that we used to do as a state. We have to bribe them to provide education. We have to bribe them to provide health. We have to bribe them to provide clean water or forest or clean forests. In general, if you ask the World Bank officials or if you ask the African Development Bank, what they would say to you is that so far, this idea of mobilizing private capital, of moving from billions to trillions, has not delivered in practice. In practice, if you look at the numbers themselves, there isn't that much private capital that has been scaled up into investable projects in the global south. And the question that this kind of promoters of de-risking ask themselves is, why has this been the case? Why don't we have enough, or why don't the ambitions to channel trillions of US dollars into countries in the global south, why haven't they materialized? And one answer that you hear very often from these promoters of de-risking is, we haven't actually finished the job of institution building in countries in the global south. Or to put it differently, there hasn't been enough institutional rewiring of the state to absorb the kind of risks that on a scale that would leverage or would dramatically increase the volume of private capital that is flowing into investable development. And if you look, for example, at the new president of the World Bank and the efforts of the United States. So the United States with the Biden administration, as you rightly pointed out, and if you read the speeches of Jake Sullivan, which is one of the sort of intellectual architects of the Biden administration's Bidenomics and its international policy decisions, what they say there is, we need to find ways of accelerating this journey from billions to trillions, we need to find ways of scaling up. And that requires, and this is where my critique of this particular development paradigm comes in. In order to do that, we can't just have multilateral development banks or official development aid from the global north putting the money in for de-risking or absorbing some of the risks. It has to be more fiscal resources from countries in the global south. So this is it. To me, it's a young development paradigm. It has a lot of elite sort of push behind it. But it requires a lot more institutional building. You know, paradigms and massive changes in institutional structures don't come overnight. So if I look at the range of recent initiatives from the United States, but also from multilateral development banks, from the European Union, they're all trying to accelerate the Wall Street consensus to build stronger institutional foundations for it.